let's get back to COVID. And, way back in February, you and I sat in that studio before we were removed by the managing editor from BCFM's FM channel. And we discussed a story from Zero Hedge, which was from, I don't know if you remember, from some Indian virologists at the Virology Institute. This is when the COVID-19 didn't exist. It was just the virus, and it was in Wuhan, and no one really knew anything about it. But these virology students in New Delhi had done a report, literally a day-long or day-and-a-half brainstorm of all the best virologists in Delhi. And they came out with this report, and they said, well, we haven't peer-reviewed this. Right, this has not been peer-reviewed, but here's our report anyway. And we're putting it out there because we think it's so important that you see this, that it appears that this virus, because the Chinese had just released the genome, it appears this virus has two deliberate protein insertions on it. One is the AIDS protein, and another one is the SARS protein. And it looks to us as if this is unlikely to have been able to occur naturally. Now, that story that led to, or some would argue, although Twitter didn't say that it was particularly that story, but a day and a half later, Zero Hedge was suspended from Twitter, and they've only just been, like 2 weeks ago, got their Twitter account back. So I would suggest everybody subscribes to Zero Hedge because they've got some fascinating information. And the reason I say that is because just this week on the BBC World Service, there's a report by Professor Adrian Hayday from King's College, and he's also from the Francis Crick Institute, who's saying, actually, look at this COVID-19, as we now call it. It seems to have the characteristics of AIDS, which was exactly what those Indian virologists were saying back in the first week of February on our show via us. So let's have a listen to him now.
At the beginning of the pandemic, it looked like COVID-19 was a respiratory illness. Now we know it can also affect other organs, and it appears it can also short-circuit the immune system, working in a way that's similar to HIV. I've been speaking to Dr. Adrian Hayday, a group leader at the Francis Crick Institute and Professor of Immunobiology at King's College London.
The surprising thing is that there are huge losses of T cells, which are lymphocytes, which are extremely important in protecting us against pathogens, that we see in COVID-19 that are reminiscent to some extent in HIV. And what's extraordinary is that HIV achieves this by directly infecting the T cells and dysregulating or reorganizing the T-cell compartment, whereas there's no evidence that the COVID virus does this. It seems to do it by some as yet unknown mechanism indirectly. And you see in post-mortem analyses necrotic areas where you would normally have T-cells, very similar to what you used to see on AIDS patient post-mortems.
Given what you've said, what are the implications then for not just treatments, but long-term recuperation, let alone vaccines?
The good news is that the immune system is usually incredibly good at bouncing back. So while there will, of course, be all sorts of appropriate downstream studies of individuals who've been through COVID-19 disease and have required hospitalization, I don't think there's any reason at this point to be concerned of long-term consequences. In the shorter term, we definitely are in a situation where a whole set of individuals, that is, these individuals who seem to require hospitalization, do seem to have been disabled for one part of their protective response. So our response in turn to that comes in multiple ways. One is to boost T-cell responses, and the other is, of course, as we go forward and think about improving vaccine designs, making sure that we consider that these individuals may be needing more support for their T-cell compartment.
Do you know enough now to say that some of the treatments will involve the kind of antiretroviral drugs that are successful to treat HIV patients?
Antiretrovirals used in HIV will have their equivalents for coronavirus. The basic research that has gone into detailed understanding of what people's immune systems look like in this disease is moving us from a place where we had general ideas to now where we've got some very specific ideas, and that always helps you in the design of improved treatment. So I'm very optimistic that this disease will get more manageable, and that's critical to reducing the global threat that the virus poses.
Optimistic news from Dr. Adrian Hayday, Group Leader at the Francis Crick Institute and Professor at King's College, London.
Well, how fascinating, and I couldn't see that reported anywhere else apart from that little item on the World Service, Martin. But you mentioned the cytokine storm, didn't you, when I was over in New Zealand? It looks as if this is absolutely key to understanding what the COVID-19 is really all about, and that quite a lot of hospitals, even though we're not medically trained, doctors basically do what they're told. If they're told it's pneumonia they've got to treat, they'll treat pneumonia. But it doesn't look as if this really was pneumonia at all.
Well, there's all sorts of things about this virus that we still don't understand. It's not a flu. We don't know what it is. The question of whether it's a bioweapon is still open. And, of course, the Murdoch press and elements within the security services have been pushing the idea that it is a bioweapon that's leaked from the Wuhan laboratory, which in fact is not a weapons laboratory. It's a research laboratory which gets lots of funds from DARPA.
They never are.
Well, no, and of course, no. Well, our ones are. They're therefore, Poulton Down is there to research bio.
Look, let's cut to the chase here, because it looks to me as if the Americans or somebody has tried to pin this on the Chinese as a Chinese virus, and it hasn't quite worked.
Well, it hasn't quite worked for a number of reasons. Also, of course, it may not have started in Wuhan. The people have found evidence of it being in Barcelona last February. So there's still lots and lots of questions out there, and I don't think we can all presume that we've got the answers. It may be a biowarfare attack, and that may explain why it is so elusive, this virus. Yeah, it's got some very interesting features.
Well, it's elusive because there's lots and lots of lies and disinformation, and there's an enormous amount of censorship going on.
Well, there is, but there's a massive amount of information, but you've got to sort your way through it.
Well, but that's not what we as members of the public are supposed to do. Journalists are supposed to do that for us, and yet they haven't been doing it, and they haven't been representing a spectrum of opinion. For example, as I said, that guy from the Francis Crick Institute, Professor Adrian Hayday, hasn't been reported anywhere so far as I can see, even though what he's saying is extremely important and would be a great use to people who are suffering from this, their relatives are, or particularly the medical profession around the world.
Well, he was being interviewed on the BBC there, so he can't say that he didn't get a
I'm saying that was the only place. So there's nobody else has picked up on this as journalists.
Well, what nobody picked up on there is it a bioweapon? If it's got bits of AIDS tacked into it, that's what the suggestion was when the Indian researchers came out with their stuff. Now, let's just run through the possibilities logically. It isn't a bioweapon. It is one of the logical. It's just a natural phenomenon, which, of course, is causing all kinds of problems. It is a bioweapon, and it was released accidentally by the Chinese. Of course, what's being suggested by Pompeo and others, that it's been deliberately released by the Chinese. But I can't see that makes any sense, because they wouldn't release it on themselves. They'd release it in the United States, wouldn't they? The third possibility is it's been released by accident by the Americans from Fort Detrick, which was closed for several months in the middle of last year for some undisclosed problem, which may have been the leakage of this. And they've all been working on bat coronaviruses, all of these laboratories. And the fourth possibility is a deliberate attack on the Chinese by the Americans or the deep state, and they're perfectly happy to have it flow back over the US because they want to bail the banks out and they want to get rid of Trump.
Now, it could also be, Martin, let's just also take up the possibility that the enormous shock to the financial system might be designed to bankrupt the planet.
Well, the shock to the financial system, this is the interesting thing, because the financial sector started collapsing in September. And that's when the Federal Reserve went into warp drive in order to try and prevent a collapse.
It's done that a few times.
Yeah, and then in November, the Israeli Defense Forces and others were warned that a pandemic was coming out of China. How did they know? I think that's very significant. How did they know?
Well, the US warned them, didn't they?
No, the US warned the IDF, but the Chinese didn't know it was going to happen. They didn't know anything was happening till December. So look at the timelines here. And therefore, I'm not convinced. I don't know. But the suspicion has to be that this is a biowarfare attack by the same people that carried out the 9/11 attacks, the same structures, in order to trash the Chinese economy just as it was getting into its stride.
Okay, so who carried out the
9/11
attacks?
The banking system.
Who carried out the 9/11 attacks?
Well, that's obviously the US security forces working with Israeli intelligence. I mean, I think that the Russian general staff and the Chinese general staff will know that. And of course, knowing that, they are very suspicious when things like this happen, especially in China, where you've had a massive swine flu epidemic, swine fever, killing off their pig herd, then they kill off their chickens, and then suddenly this comes along. Just at the moment when they're in a trade war with the US.
Okay,
the
so
US is quite capable of doing underhand things.
Well, it might not necessarily be the US authorities, might it? It might be the CIA, intelligence services, people within the CIA, or even corporate interests, arms industry, the arms industry.
Yeah, we're talking about the deep state here. The deep state needs enemies, and there's something called the Thucydides trap, which is a book written not long ago, and it's about how rising powers like China always come into conflict with existing powers like the US.
Well,
they compared it to the rivalry between Athens and Sparta. So they're talking about if we don't break the legs of the Chinese now, we're not going to get the chance. So let's go for it.
People like Pepe Escobar have been talking about hybrid warfare. But look, anyway, let's have a listen now to the real victims of the deep state, if this is the case. And that is young people, because that came up at Prime Minister's questions, the way that the whole